We're live.
Good morning, our viewers. Welcome to the ICHRRF's monthly Speaking Up series. My name is Dr. Adityanji, and I am the president of the ICHRRF. You are looking at my PowerPoint, and that shows you the logo of the ICHRRF. On behalf of the Board of Directors and the Executive Committee of the ICHRF, I invite all our viewers to our monthly Speaking Up series, Oration. A little bit about ICHRRF. That stands for International Commission for Human Rights and Religious Freedom. We are a US-based nonprofit organization focused on upholding human rights and religious freedom all over the world through continuous monitoring, intervention, and collaboration. We are focused on educational, research, legal, and human rights and advocacy issues for charitable purposes, and we strive to be an advocate for human rights and religious freedom of underrepresented minorities across the world, including the United States. And that is very, very important. We believe that humankind can no longer afford to be selective about rights of only a specific set of people. A humane and just world necessitates fair treatment of all living beings. Our focus is on indigenous rights and freedom, free speech, and their cultural preservation. Therefore, at the ICHRRF, we strive to be the voice for the voiceless. Some of our initiatives include monitoring violations of freedom and sanctity of religious and philosophical minority across the world, research into and documentation of the culture and history and biases faced by such communities, policy recommendations on human rights, religious diversity, and pluralism to international organizations, agencies, and national and state governments, collaboration to support the cultural and philosophical diversity across the world. We have a Professor Ved Nanda Memorial Fellowship Training Program. We also do a conference generally once a year, but now we are going to do it every 2 years. The last one was done in October of 2025 at George Mason University in Virginia. So, for our distinguished lecture today, the topic is the locked schoolroom, how the Church of England kept British women in darkness. And our distinguished speaker today is Pandit Satish Sharma, MBCS, FRSA, FRAS. FRAS stands for, I guess, Fellow of Royal Asiatic Society. Just for the sake of record, today is Saturday, May 30th, 2026. It's 10 a.m. Eastern Time in United States and Canada. And of course, you're going to see our honorable speaker, but this is a picture. Pandit Satish Sharma is a mathematician, an auditor, and he has had multiple directorships, having seen management, senior management, and IT-related, jobs with international experience for the last 25 years. Now, that's a highly scientific area. You have to be logical and precise, but in parallel, he also became a scholar of Dharmic traditions. He's a very well-respected interfaith speaker and has spoken on many gatherings, including schools, universities, temples, cathedrals, and general gatherings, where seekers of truth wisdom congregate. He was recently awarded the title of Dharma Samrakshak, custodian of Dharma, and authorized to speak on 6 darshans of Indian philosophy by the Council of Hindu Swamis and Saints in Rishikesh. Again, he's a TEDx speaker. I'm not going to read his sort of bio, but it is truly, truly impressive. So this is a picture that is about the topic, the locked schoolroom for women in not so far away history. So, the phrase locked schoolroom is a historical critique, how institutional theology, rooted in Church of England, actually systematically restrict the education and autonomy of British women well into the 18th century and beyond. I'm not going to say much about it because I want our distinguished speaker to speak about it. But there was religious subjugation of women, seamlessly aligned with British common law. And for centuries, a married woman's legal rights were surrendered to her husband, barring her from voting, owning property, or entering high education. And as early as the beginning of 20th century, there were auctions held for wife selling if there was no option of divorce. So, Pandit Satish Sharma recently wrote an article that was published on 2 platforms, and one of them happened to be our platform. And a blurb from that paper says, let us be particular about what happened to British women in 18th century. It was not neglect, it was not oversight, it was not the gentle inertia of tradition. It was a calculated, theologically engineered system of intellectual imprisonment, designed, sustained, and scripture stamped by the Christian Church or Church of England over the course of 18 centuries, bearing the fullest and most brutal fruit in Georgian England. This seminar will be followed by a Q&A session by Pandit Satish Sharma. Just shows you an institution. Again, the picture of Pandit Satish Sharma. And I'll end with this. Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. Speak up and judge fairly. That's our motto, because we are the voice of the voiceless. A little bit about housekeeping rules. Keep yourself on mute mode to avoid noise interference. Please change your cell phone to vibration mode. Please do not interrupt our distinguished speaker. We will entertain questions only after the speaker is done with his presentation. All the questions are moderated through chat room. Please be very brief and precise in questions. Don't write a lengthy monologue in form of a lecture. Those comments will be neglected. This event is being recorded. It will be available on our YouTube channel as well as on our website. Those members of the audience who request certificate of attendance, they can send an email to christina.kalasunas@ichrrf.org. As we are registered as a 501c3 charitable organization in the United States, we request our US-based donors to donate and financially support the ICHRRF. The links are there on our website. And without further ado, it is my distinguished honor and pleasure to invite our speaker for the today, Pandit Satish Sharma. Sir, welcome to you on ICHRRF platform.
Jai Shri Ramji, Namaskaram, and good afternoon or good morning to you, depending upon where you are in the world. Firstly, I would like to just extend a brief thank you for the opportunity to address your august audience, especially on such an obscure subject. I'd also like to extend an apology. I must do something about that lengthy introduction. Although it was flattering to hear how wonderful I am, I just felt that, my goodness, somebody who's done so much must be really old. So we have to do something to minimize that and just keep it much, much smaller. I won't take too much time. This is a subject which I'm going to take you through a PowerPoint presentation, and I will start with my conclusion. The conclusion is to hopefully leave yourselves with an understanding of historical, evidence-supported facts about this particular subject. I want to be able to try and leave the audience with an idea that there are some very uncomfortable realities about the past that we have all traversed, but if we approach them with compassion and understanding, we can actually start to learn from them and move forward and put to right some of the wrongs that still cast shadows into the present. The driving force behind this particular exploration, it emerged from my study of the dark period when Bharat, that is India, was colonized, the impact on the indigenous Bharatiya identity at that time. I was seeking to identify some of the perhaps psychoses or neuroses which are still present in that identity, and then to try and trace them back to where they emerged from. One of the things that I stumbled across was a continuous tirade, shall we say, a messaging, a narrative that Bharat had for a long period of time neglected its womenfolk and had suppressed them, denied them teaching, denied them power and authority. And being a scholar of our scriptures, that was not evidence supported, but also it was actually philosophically and theologically incorrect. So originally I wanted to understand, was there a difference between what our scriptures said and the reality of how the largely Hindu Indian civilization practiced those scriptures with regard to women? I came across the work of many of the early missionaries, William Carey, Fuller, and others, and suddenly found a stream of invective, I suppose is the only word for it, which was the foundation for this body of thought, this narrative, and this momentum that India had a terrible history of dealing and relating to women, and so it needed to be saved from that. Now, I'm a great believer in, if I'm going to employ a plumber, I want to see that his house has got wonderful plumbing. You know the old adage about a cobbler's shoes. If you're going to buy expensive shoes, you want to see that the cobbler's shoes are actually also an example of his craft. And so I started to explore the situation of British women in the 17 and 1800s in the United Kingdom, and came across an extraordinary, wealthy body of records which had been maintained largely by American women authors and scholars, in which they recorded their own personal lived experience and that of their sisters in terms of education. So having dived into that for a period of time, I managed to extract a summary, and what Dr. Adityanji published and has referred to was a small extract of that summary. So with the blessing of the gods of technology, I'm now going to try and share a screen and hopefully walk you through a summary of my findings. Okay, so hopefully you now can see a, yep, perfect. Thank you very much. So this is broken into 4 areas: documented instances of denial to education, interlocking rationales, the reasoning that were given and the reasons that were presented as to why women should be denied access to education. And then I wanted to know whether it was institutionalized. Were there culpable institutions? Were there legislative edicts, etc., which were responsible for this particular deprivation? And then I wanted to have an idea of a time period. And so this is where we shall start our journey. So turning to the background, I wanted to answer the assertion that India was a terrible place as far as women's education is concerned. And so I did some research into that whole space, and the research and the evidence that I've managed to dig up, in summary, I could put forward the assertion that the legal and social status of women in India was ritual equality. They were entitled to the Brahminical thread, you know, the Janeu, which is the mark of a person who has been initiated into some sort of a discipline. Women were fully entitled to it, and we have more than adequate evidence for that. In terms of intellectual rights, they possessed the right to study and to preach the Vedas, which for a spiritual society whose pinnacle is spiritual attainment, and for that level of understanding, knowledge, and attainment to be freely open to women, was absolutely the position prior to our period of colonization. And then I looked for evidence of access. And the Sanskrit root Vidya, I found an interesting little note, and that was that the Sanskrit root Vidya, wisdom, it connects Veda to the term widow, and originally the word widow meant a woman who knows. So just an interesting aside. Then I started to explore other non-Christian civilizations. Ancient Egypt, they had a priesthood, but also the priesthood was open to women who were described as sacred scribes. Again, institutional learning, evidence is there to support the assertion that it was actually supported to the extent that they had colleges specifically for women of principal families to engage in study and education. And Egypt has a long history, widely recorded, of being indebted to priestesses for major literature. Moses' education itself was controlled by a princess-led college. I thought that was a very interesting discovery as well. Ancient Rome, Moorish Spain, and Malabar, all of them show a similar profile where women have equal legal and social status, equal intellectual rights, and evidence of access is there in abundance. So this was the background that I started to build my exploration on. So where did it all go wrong, and how did it go wrong? Now, there is an interesting aspect which I think is probably the first of the dominoes, and that was that education was a particular skill of the priesthood. That priests were allowed, they were entitled, they were encouraged, they were instructed to be able to read, to be able to write, and to be able to study. The other dimension, the other side of that coin, is that the priesthood was specifically forbidden to women in the early Christian period. And so if you did not want women to become priests, and the mark of a priest was that they were learned, that they could read, write, and they were educated, the philosophy and the policy emerged of denying women access to reading and writing. And I'd remind you that this is the time when the printing press was declared as a creation of the devil, as Satan's work. It's the time when William Tyndale, who translated the first Bible into a language that the common man could read, and was killed for it. So there was an extremely severe penalty for going against the rules and the edicts that the church governed its priesthood with. So looking at the mechanisms, I came across something called the Great Interdiction, and it was universal church doctrine. And it was the formal classification of female learning as an especial element of evil. So knowledge was framed as a reenactment of Eve's original disobedience, making ignorance a required theological virtue for women. Another instance occurred where the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, and the authority was Pope Innocent III plus his 1300 prelates, and they produced a formal prohibition of scriptures to the laity. And so a total prohibition of reading for women enabled them to concentrate all textual power into a male priesthood. Leaping forward a few decades, a few centuries in fact, we have the Statute of Henry VIII. And we are aware of his relationship with women and how he held them in not as much high regard as we'd like the kings of England to be remembered for. But he issued an explicit civil statute which prohibited women from reading the Bible. The law categorized women and others of low degree as a single class of individuals to be legally denied access to the vernacular word. And then we have a reference to St. Paul, the founder of Christianity, institutionalized Christianity. The command for women to keep silence in the church, it operated as a comprehensive ban on theological discourse. In fact, it denied the women the right of private judgment and even participation in primary intellectual activity. The epistles of St. Paul is the formal authority for that statement. And then we have a German contribution, where the ecclesiastical transition, it documents a regression from the supremely wise prophetesses, that was the status of pre-Christian German women, to a state where education was denied and servile labor in fields and mines was imposed as a coordinated program. So this is a quick run through geographically, but also in terms of chronologically, the nature of these sentiments that were gathering power to themselves and how they were then implementing that power. So I looked for more details about the structural mechanisms of this inclusion. And the church in the 7th to the 11th century established itself an absolute textual monopoly. It owned literature. And this was confined to an exclusively male and celibate priesthood. And I'll refer to that a little bit later on as well. And then there were statutes which enforced physical control over women during their prime educational window. And so magistrates were given the authority to bind any woman to servile labor by court order. We have a reference to some of the legislative documents, but there was one other contribution which was in the time of Cromwell, which is when the Reformation was happening. And one would expect that the Reformation would have actually lessened the burden and the strictures upon women, but in fact, even under the Cromwellian time, it was tightened even further. The Cromwellian codes introduced a Puritan code, and it said that for a woman to be engaged in intellectual pursuits, it was deemed to be a peril to social position. Wives were precluded from using genius or talent without explicit husbandly consent. And then we have an outpouring of this sentiment across the European continent. The outpouring was to reinforce and establish male dominance using the language of religion, and the term witch came into common use. And witchcraft was the label given to intellectual insurgency, as I've described it here. Originally, the word witch, it had its roots in Wiccan, and that was a wise or a learned woman. It's estimated in official records that 9 million executions of women followed the 1484 bull of Pope Innocent VIII, and the greater number of them were women of superior empirical knowledge. That's a devastating blow on any civilization, any nationality, any nation, and any population. So the church actively cultivated female ignorance as a theological virtue, and it reinforced that position using public torture. And it wanted to also create an environment in which having knowledge itself was perceived as evil and dangerous. One other thing I discovered was that much of the healing knowledge and the healing arts was in the hands of women, wise women, and they, shall we say, received the particular focus of the church. There was a decree that any woman healing without study was a witch. Meanwhile, women were formally interdicted from all institutions of medical study. Use of anesthetics, even in childbirth, was prosecuted as a violation of this doctrinal decree. Paracelsus in 1527 threw all his medical works onto the fire, saying that he knew nothing except what he had learned from witches. Then I turned to theological justification. Where did this unnatural frame of mind have its roots? And I came across the work of an extraordinary woman scholar in the United States called Matilda Gage, and I would recommend everybody has a scrutiny of her work. She was part of the suffragette movement and was determined not to be denied the opportunity of educating herself, studying, and then allowing her sisters to have access to the same advantages. And she identified two primary theological pillars, which I've just summarized here. The first was the core rationale of original sin. And the theological basis which drove that was that Eve introduced knowledge through disobedience. Therefore, knowledge in a woman's hands reenacts the original catastrophe. And the key authorities for that were St. Augustine and St. Paul in their own writing. In 1632, a statute by the Church, the Roman Catholic Church, it said original sin was cited as a reason for exclusion from Parliament. Intellectual pursuit was categorized as evil and dangerous. The second core rationale which Matilda Gage established was the notion of created inferiority. And this is a theme that runs through her whole work. Women as a secondary thought or as an appendage to man. Her nature is claimed to be inherently deficient in reason. And Aristotle, surprisingly, and also the Church Fathers in their canon, they enforced and proliferated this perspective as well. There were formal debates on whether learning was an additional capacity for evil, and it ascribed a lack of a rational soul, and that precluded educational rights. So women had some sort of a defective soul, and by virtue of that, they were to be denied access to education. I then dug into the notion of knowledge as a power and the desire to hold knowledge in a position of monopoly. And sacred and secret were originally synonymous terms used to restrict learning to an exclusively male celibate clergy. And so they proliferated the idea that knowledge was sacred and secret, and that was one of the foundation stones of their monopoly. Another aspect which I encountered was that scientific knowledge held by the Church was its primary instrument of spiritual and temporal control. It's a common adage which many of us use quite loosely, that knowledge is power. It was literally power at that time, and access to knowledge was the manner in which power was shared or restricted. The Pauline authority, created in 18th century lever, where scriptural wants were used to systematically oppose women's created and religious equality. So Pauline authority was used to prevent, consciously, deliberately, and actively, women's access to knowledge. An extraordinary statement, extraordinary in this day and age, was that of mandated silence. The Pauline injunction to keep silence in church functioned as a total ban on theological and intellectual participation. And there was also an intellectual veto. A subordination to man as head subjected all female intellectual conclusions to male oversight. And then I've expanded on how these were implemented in my PowerPoint. And Aditya, I'll be happy to share the PowerPoint with you so that you can then distribute this as an additional supporting material for persons wanting to explore the path. So we've seen how the theology developed and evolved to protect access to knowledge, and then found means for articulating that in canonical statements. But there was also a legal framework which was created, and it became the synergy of canonical law and then civil law. So it moved from just the theological sphere into the sphere of law itself. We have the denial of property rights to women established, and it was both canon and common law. And then there was a statement of marital coverture, legal non-existence upon marriage. So the total loss of contract capacity and standing the moment a woman became married. We had servile labour binding. There was statutory requirements for women from the age of 11 to 40 to be bound to servile labour. And that consumed the entire period in which educational formation can occur. And that was a part of the Elizabethan civil statutes, not religious statutes. There was obviously, from Henry VIII's time, the prohibition of Bible reading. And also, I mentioned the Fourth Lateran Council. They had a formal prohibition of scriptures to the laity, especially to women at that time. An interesting little oddity that I noticed was there was a restriction to one woman per cottage to prevent the formation of informal learning circles or collective intellectual activity. So physically, preventing more than one woman from occupying a cottage or household was intended to prevent conversation and exploration of intellectual activity. So I think the general mood is now beginning to become apparent at that time. And Matilda Gage, she concluded that denial to education wasn't just a peripheral byproduct of prejudice, but a calculated structural necessity to specifically maintain the hierarchy of both church and state. So the subjugation of women and denial of educational opportunity arose as a result out of the desire of the church and the state to maintain their hegemony. So I thought, well, who is this hegemonistic cabal? Let's have a deeper dive. And naturally, one of the largest powers at that time was the Catholic Church. And the primary mechanism of suppression that the Catholic Church wielded was the theological interdiction of knowledge, a formal denial of women's humanity. And there is evidence which I've included in here, historical evidence of document as well as institution. The Protestant churches appeared next on my horizon, and there's an intensification of domestic codes, the denial of private judgment and independent wisdom. Those were the primary mechanisms of suppression and denial of women's education. Luther, often touted as a reformer, he stated that wisdom was an ill-fitting garment for women. In the Reformation period, there are domestic rules and 5 codes of obedience, and they can be explored individually. But the Protestant churches also, in Gage's final assessment, created an intellectual exclusion which was no less complete than the Catholic vision. So those are the two theological institutions who created obstacles for women to engage in education. Turning to the state, according to Gage, their primary mechanism of suppression was the statutory enforcement of theological subordination and servile labor. So the law enforced the strictures which are placed upon women without reference necessarily to canonical law at all. Civil law translated canonical law into concrete physical and social constraints. Gage was not sparing in her explorations. She also identified the legal profession at the time, and my research has confirmed this. Juridical normalization of witchcraft and legal non-existence, that was the legal profession which did it. Blackstone's commentaries, extraordinarily interesting reading. They endorsed witchcraft. And there was the Malleus Maleficarum, the Roman text, which enabled people like the Witchfinder General in Great Britain to identify what a witch was, who was a witch, and then to arrange for the appropriate justified termination in the vast majority of cases. The medical profession, this was a surprise to me, but the medical profession itself violently suppressed the female empirical knowledge to secure any monopoly. So the areas of midwifery, maternity, women's health, all of those were violently opposed by the medical profession, and they acted consciously to prevent women from entering into that space at all. In the 14th century, there was a death for healing without study. That was the sentence. And I mentioned the appropriation of anesthetics as well from women. Belladonna and natural herbs, which we use as anesthetic during pregnancy, were also banned. Bear with me 1 second. I think we've had a technical glitch. So hopefully you can now see the screen again.
Yes, we can.
I'm just okay. I think one of my fingers did a right click instead of a left click. Okay, so just going back to the institutions. Okay, that was my last slide. I've got one concluding slide which I have on my screen, and I just wanted to wrap up with that. My exploration was intending to achieve two things. One was to establish the credibility or not of the institutions which arrived in India and which then began to preach to Indians that their own ancestral knowledge was deficient, that it was unjust, that it was unfair, and it needed their intervention to re-establish women's rights. That I found to be unsupported. It was incorrect. They were not basing it on a desire to do good, but what they wanted to do was actually replicate the same structures with which they had controlled women throughout Europe for the best part of a millennium in India at that time. The other thing I wanted to explore was the impact of their teachings on their own indigenous female population. And the evidence that I've presented briefly to you supported the idea that misogyny was institutional, that it was supported by every pillar of the state, whether theological, whether economic, whether judicial. And so it was completely a foundation and pillar of the European society of that time. And so that drew me to the conclusion that not only were they not practicing the high morals that they actually wished to, shall we say, preach in India, they were completely behaving contrary to that. And as a consequence, what they gave us in India, Matthew, I think, sums it up in the best manner, Matthew 7, where Matthew declares that a bad tree cannot bear good fruit and a good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and that a tree is known by the fruit that it bears. And I think the conclusion that I'd like to share with everybody is that the period that we've talked about, in which the Bharatiya identity was scarred, violently scarred in its own understanding of its relationship with women, that now needs to be healed. We have the evidence to help it heal. We have the evidence for it to return to an understanding which is based on Dharmic scriptures. And there is a section in my analysis which shows the counter position that the Dharmic scriptures put forward for each and every set of circumstances and each and every set of parameters. We have a counterbalance in the Dharmic framework, which is actually very pro-equality, which is completely understanding of the shared divinity of both genders, of both sexes. And so from here, we move forward to hopefully a time where we can start to spread this knowledge and undo some of the harm that our decolonizing Bharatiya identity is currently engaged in. I think I have said so much, and there's a lot of information, a lot of data in there. I didn't want to dive too much into statistics and numbers on a hot summer's Saturday afternoon, but the data is available for those who wish to interrogate it a little bit further. Adityaji, may I revert back to you?
Thank you very much indeed, Pandit Satish Sharma ji, for a very educational, very informative lecture on the status of women's education in ancient and medieval UK or Britain. We are truly honored to have you with this, deep fund of information. And I'm pretty sure that there'll be a lot of questions, not just now, but later on also. So we'll continue to interact with you in future on the same subject, because we are deeply, advocating rights of women across the communities, across the globe. And doing a historic analysis actually helps us to project for the future. Before I go on to questions from the chat room, I have a question of my own. So, Satish ji, the monarch is the head of Church of England. And if I remember, Queen Mary, Queen Matilda, Queen Victoria were monarchs in ancient as well as medieval period, and also more recently Queen Victoria in 18th and 19th century, having been monarch and having been head of the Church of England, especially Queen Victoria, because her reign lasted almost 65 years, were they not able to influence the church that they were heading themselves to emancipate English women from the clutches of the clergy?
It's a wonderful question to start on. Whether they could or they couldn't is a secondary position. Whether they desired to is a primary position. We are talking now from a framework where the Church of England has only just appointed its first ever female Archbishop of Canterbury. And the ripples of that one impact on the church itself, it has almost caused the Anglican communion to split into two. It is such a divergence from what they have been preaching for such a long period of time. And not only do we have a woman as the Anglican Archbishop, the policies that she's introducing and talking about introducing are also, some are perceiving them as a breath of fresh air. Now, with regard to the title of Head of the Church, this is it's worth knowing that the Church of England was not started by a moment of revelation. There was nobody on the road to Damascus who had some Damascene vision. It wasn't started by an inspiration from a religious or a spiritually enlightened person. It was born simply out of Henry VIII's desire to break his marriage to Anne Boleyn, I think it was at the time, and he wanted to marry her maid-in-waiting. The Roman Catholic Church said, no, we're not having any of that. Not at that time, the Roman Catholic Church wasn't particularly powerful, but the Queen herself was related to one of the most powerful kings in Europe. And so the church was not going to risk upsetting one of their most powerful patrons by giving Henry what he wanted. So Henry decided, I don't need papal oversight. And he created the church himself and placed himself as the head of that particular church. And now being the head of that church and having rejected the authority of the Roman Catholic Church, he suddenly had the opportunity to take ownership of all of the assets of the Roman Catholic Church. And then he didn't keep them to himself. He created an elite layer to whom he gifted much of what he had seized from the Roman Catholic Church, and that's how the British aristocracy was born. And so he took the assets of the old spiritual and temporal rulership, acquired them, redistributed, and created a completely new structure. The structure was entirely political. It was entirely to do with power. And so when the reins of that power were passed down generation to generation, it was actually a move and a transfer of power as opposed to anything to do with spiritual or religious authority. And I've often said to my colleagues in interfaith, when I'm feeling a bit more mischievous than sensible, that most of the religious traditions around the world can trace their roots back to a human being who was enlightened by some divine touch, whereas the Church of England has actually never had that as its driving energy. And if you look at what they did when they ventured out into the world, there were 62 nations that they dominated and took over, and the church accompanied them. The Church of England is actually a church of empire and not so much a church of Christ. And so the empire and its power was something that the queens that you have mentioned held very dear to themselves and wielded as an implement of power, with very little regard for wanting to elevate the status of women in the theological sense in this country.
Thank you for that very elaborate answer. I'm satisfied in my curiosity. Now I will read some of the questions from the chat room. So the first question is from Mr. Carl Clements. To what extent was the Christian suppression of women a reaction to the power women once held in pagan institutions of power and knowledge structures, Were there other reasons the church feared female emancipation?
It's a wonderful thought. When I was tracking this particular line of history, I came to the Code of Theodosius, one of the Roman emperors, who enacted a legal document, a legal principle, which authorized the erasure of non-Christian ideologies right across the church, right across the Roman Empire, through most of Europe. And at that time, the vast majority of wisdom was actually held in informal matriarchies. It was mothers and daughters and healers and people who knew the herbs and the mystery of birth and bringing forth life. It very much was an informal matriarchy. And the church, when the Theodosius emerged, was absolutely adamant that in order for it to have power, it would need to remove any competition. I refer to these as Galileo moments, because in history, whenever the church encountered a person who was articulating a scientifically valid or an experientially valid body of knowledge, which conflicted with the outcome of the Council of Nicaea, it was always the church which resorted to violence to diminish that. So I think it was always a pursuit of male hegemony. And what emerged out of the Council of Nicaea was actually an incredible textbook for, I've got an analysis of this appearing in another book. It was a mechanism whereby a human being could have their head and their heart injured without them ever knowing it. So much so that both intellect and compassion were tarnished with doubt, but also with guilt or fear. And so the person that you could create was a person who was then so much more vulnerable to being enslaved. And so that was the inheritance that Theodosius received from Constantine. And so using the technology of human enslavement and the desire to expand his range of power, an outpouring of violence against the traditional holders of wisdom, it flooded right the way across Europe. And so I don't think it was I don't think it was a healthy response to the fact that women had power. I think it was an unhealthy response driven by a desire for power at any cost. Violence, whether it was male, whether it was female, whether it was pagan, whether it was heretic, the hegemony had to rest in the holder of the keys to the canon of Nicaea.
Thank you. The next question is from Dr. Shrikant Chopra, who is a fellow physician and Imsonian. And the question is, what were the parameters of the women's status in late 18th and early 19th century in Europe when these colonial powers were conquering the colonies and making judgments on their social practices in a comparative manner? You have briefly alluded to it, but this is a more explicit question on the same theme.
It's a wonderful question. It allows me to introduce another small, shall we say, potentially new idea to our esteemed watchers. The first country that was colonized by the British was England. I often say to people in this country that I know the English identity. I grew up with English people in the Midlands, and they are solid, robust, straightforward, no frills folk. I know the Scottish identity, the Welsh identity, and the Irish identity, and I never met a British person until I came to London, and especially to Westminster. Now, an American philosopher once wrote that the Englishman is the best of all men, and the British the worst. And so this notion that all of the people of these islands went out and colonized and then brought all of their ill-gotten gains back here and everybody benefited is not true. The British colonized this country. The first partition where they practiced their partition theory was actually the island of Ireland. And so they tested, how do you partition a community? How do you divide and rule it? How do you cause eternal conflict? Here in the United Kingdom. And so one thing that I discovered I'd like to share in response to that excellent question is that the domestic population did not benefit from the extraction from 62 colonies. It came into the City of London. They created an incredible structure whereby they convinced the people of Ireland, Scotland, and England that they were part of a united kingdom, when in reality they were nothing more than exchequer fodder, and then squirreled away the vast majority of the illegally acquired loot in tax havens all around the world. So there is a central Britain, and that British identity is separate and distinct in many legal as well as physical aspects from the United Kingdom. In my research at the time, I wanted to know when those boats came back to the East India docks laden with indigo, which was like the gold of that time, how much benefit accrued to the people of this country. And I found that one of the only benefits that children got was that instead of working a 10-hour day, they were now able to work an 8-hour day. So poverty outside of Britain was not alleviated by the expansion of this Christianist empire.
Thank you for that answer. I have a query related to that. You may have already clarified it, but it's much more specific. Parallel to what was happening in Church of England, was the same kind of suppression used by Church of Scotland also historically, where the monarch or the king was not head of the Church of Scotland?
The Church of Scotland, again, a wonderful question. The Church of Scotland has an equally guilty role in terms of what its flock did when they ventured out from these islands. The Church of Scotland was as oppressive to its own people as the Church of England, but it produced some people who had an incredible... there is a concept called the dark triad, and it's a particular type of personality. It's when three threads combine. One is civilizational narcissism, the other is a Machiavellian streak, and then the third is psychopathy. So when those three combine in a person, you will find that a lot of that personality type gravitate towards religious institutions. And so the Church of Scotland produced a number of people of that ilk. And one of them I've been studying, and perhaps your listeners will have already come across, James Mill, who wrote The History of India, never visited India. And yet all of the ills that he saw in the clergy-driven United Kingdom, he ascribed them to India. So he would find a flaw in something that was terrible here, the enslavement of children and the denial of rights for women, and then he wrote about it at length in his History of India, never having visited it. And the impact of that one work was devastating for Indians right across the whole of the subcontinent. And there are others. Macauliffe, who emerged from Scotland as well, did as much harm to the Indian subcontinent, and again on the basis of narcissism, civilizational narcissism, on the base of Machiavellian, the capacity for Machiavellian manipulation, and obviously greed. So I'm afraid the Church of England was equally driven, motivated, directed, and supported by people of as questionable character as the Church of England.
Thank you. The next question brings us back to the contemporary situation, geopolitical situation, and projections for the future. And the question is from our Executive Director, Mr. Clements. The rise of the new right across the West is also seeing a harking back to the Catholic traditionalism. Do you see a problem for women's rights in the new ideological landscape? And before you go on to that, we witness it every day in United States when abortion as a choice for women is being taken away from that. So the effects are already being felt, but of course we would like your comments on this particular question.
So this is a question which has laid out in front of me a potential minefield. And so I'm going to choose my words very carefully. Christian nationalism is absolutely a problem. Yes, it is resurging, and there is a socio-economic profile when this happens. In Bharat, we had a situation of incredible chaos, great turbulence, uncertainty when it came to being able to even sustain oneself, never mind sustaining one's family. And in those circumstances, a powerful authority figure can actually intervene and guide and take over that person's, their judgment and everything else. Authority at a time of dependency, authority at a time of turmoil, the promise of stability in those times is a very, very potent offering. And these are the times that we're facing now. So yes, we will see a resurgence as people reach out to something which they think will give them a sense of permanence and stability. And the institutions which have the capacity to project that merely by virtue of the fact that they've existed for so long and they've managed to influence so many people and exert so much power, they have the toolkit to wield it and take advantage of it. One of the consequences, inevitably, and we're seeing this in some of the more fundamental Christianist missions and their language, they are fundamentally misogynistic. They are fundamentally required by Scripture to deprive half of the human family from their innate declaration of human rights. A time is going to come when I think we will have to make a choice between the two. Do we elevate human rights above religious rights? And I think that will be the leap forward for humanity. We have got that opportunity in front of us. You mentioned at the beginning that your institute and organization is engaged in freedom of religion and belief. And that, I think, too, is going to come under scrutiny. In Bharat, the Dharmic and the Vedic tradition elevates freedom of thought and freedom of speech above freedom of belief and freedom of religion, because one of those, especially at this time, actually hinders the other. And so we're going to see a transition at the same time, I believe, to freedom of thought and speech. And I think we're seeing throughout Europe how that's being challenged. Freedom of religion and belief is becoming very strongly entrenched, and freedom of speech and thought is actually being confined and constrained on a daily basis here in the United Kingdom.
Thank you very much indeed, Pandit Satish Sharma, for a very enlightening lecture and an equally illuminating discussion and the way you answered the questions for our audience members. I must say that we were blessed to have you impart the knowledge about the status of women in historical Christian society in England, both medieval as well as more contemporary. To our audience, you will have access to this video recording within next 24 hours. It becomes an educational resource. I am highly thankful to Pandit Satish Sharma for taking his valuable time to meet with us and educate us and enlighten us with some, deep research into historical trends in Britain. I am also thankful to our audience members who joined us on a Saturday morning here in US and whatever time, but spending part of their weekend on somewhat esoteric subject. It's not generally talked about. People are more concerned about the present and the future, but not on the past. But past gives us answers to what is happening in today's world and how the trends are emerging, because without understanding the past, we are condemned to repeat it as a cliche. But again, this is the first time Pandit Satish Sharma has been on our platform. He has published a article on the same subject on our website, and we hope that he'll continue to grace our platform in future as well and be a partner in this dialogue for promotion of human rights and philosophical diversity. Thank you very much indeed, sir. Truly blessed to have you here.
Gee, I'm honored, and I look forward to equally stimulating and refreshing conversations in the future. I think we have much to offer. We're working out the vocabulary with which we can navigate this, as I call it, a minefield, and I think the outcome of it will only be good. So thank you for allowing me to share some ideas and to rummage around in some of your thoughts and understandings. I'm honored. Jai Shri Ramji. Om.
Namaskar. We'll be ending this meeting.